Hello and welcome to the Westminster Institute. I'm Robert Riley, its director. Today I'm particularly pleased to welcome back to the Westminster Institute Dr. Steve Bryen, with whom we've already done a number of shows, some on technology, some on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which will be our subject today. But first, some background on our speaker. He's a leading expert in security, strategy, and technology. He's held senior positions in the Department of Defense on Capitol Hill and is president of a large multinational defense and technology company. Currently, Dr. Bryen is a senior fellow at the American Center for Democracy at the Center for Security Policy. He has served as senior staff director of the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as the executive director of a grassroots political organization, as the head of the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, and as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Trade Security Policy, and as the founder and first director of the Defense Technology Security Administration. Dr. Bryen is the author of some 5 books, including Technology, Security, and National Power, Winners and Losers, and of 3 volumes of essays on technology, security, and strategy. Dr. Bryen was twice awarded the Defense Department's highest civilian honor, the Distinguished Service Medal. He's joining us today to discuss the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Is there a way out? Steve, welcome back to the
Thank
program.
you. Nice to be with you.
Well, let's do a big picture scene setter of this topic. The so-called realist school claims that NATO and the United States trespassed on an area of vital national security of Russia, that being Ukraine, which for most of its existence has been under either part of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, or at least beholden to Russia, and that the war was precipitated by the insistence on the part of the United States and NATO that Ukraine could become a member, and indeed should become a member. Now, another side says, no, that's not the problem. The problem is the contest between autocracy and democracy. So the stakes of this conflict are not local to that part of the world, but in fact affect the entire world. And should Russia, unprovoked, invade a neighboring country that is independent and free and impose its will by force of arms, and succeed in doing this, this simply offers the example to China to take Taiwan in a similar way, and other autocrats to behave in such a way. So the stakes are really larger. They're global. In fact, in a way, everything is at stake.
That's true.
Do you want to comment on?
Well, I think you could say it's both things, actually. I mean, you can't walk. The fact is the Russians regard Ukraine as their backyard. They regard it as strategic because it has access to the Black Sea. It had in Crimea a major naval port, Sevastopol, which was quite crucial to the Russians and to the Ukrainians. It's a big breadbasket for the world, has always been. But it also has a large Russian-speaking population. And that is found primarily along the eastern side of the country and to the south. And that part, the struggle between the Ukrainian government and the Russian speakers has been intense. And people don't like to talk about that these days. But it was intense. It still is intense. And it's partly Russian speaking, it's partly religious, because now there's a crackdown by the Ukrainian authorities on the Russian Orthodox Church, a very nasty crackdown, where priests are being arrested, and where reportedly, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it's reported that the Ukrainians actually have set up snipers to pick off Orthodox priests supporting the Russian troops, using snipers to kill them.
How credible is that?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. But it's not coming from Russian sources. So it may be true. But it's certainly true that the Ukrainian government has been arresting priests, shutting down some of the Russian Orthodox churches. And basically, so it's a war not only of ethnicity, but it's also in language, but it's also a war of religion. So you have that kind of thing mixed in. It's not a happy thing. The second point is that Ukraine is barely a democracy. I mean, it had elections. Zelensky was elected, but all the opposition was arrested. So there isn't any effective opposition in Ukraine today. Either they're arrested or they've had to leave the country and they're operating elsewhere.
Well, how much of that, if I may interrupt, Steve, is simply due to the fact that it's a country at war?
Well, but it happened before it was at war. But
okay.
I mean, the other part of the problem, and this is what makes this whole mixture very complicated, is the fact, and I think this is the thing that propelled the Russians into making a rather unfortunate decision to invade Ukraine, was the buildup of Ukrainian forces by NATO, and particularly by the United States, over 8 or 9 years, where the Russians thought that this was not only going to become a NATO-aligned country, but it was going to be a military power aimed at Russia's underbelly. And this is something they didn't find acceptable. So from their point of view, the war was justified on that basis. And that's where we are. I mean, where we are now is the two new so-called republics, Luhansk and Donetsk, and then the southern corridor to Crimea are sort of what are known as the Russian objectives in this war. I think their objectives have changed from that to something more, but at least officially that's what the Russians say. My own opinion is that the Russians want a friendly government in Kiev and don't want an unfriendly government. And if that means essentially toppling the existing government, then they're prepared to do it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I see it.
Well, that certainly gives a range. The current situation is that both sides are expecting a major offensive.
Yes.
The Ukrainians now claim that Russia has twice as many troops in eastern Ukraine as they used in the initial invasion, so some 300,000 troops. Mm-hmm. And they're probing all along the line of the length of some 140 or more miles in the Donetsk region, trying to find the weak spots. And the Ukrainians are expecting a major initiative from the Russians. They simply don't know exactly where it's going to come.
That's right.
It's life difficult for them. And this has accelerated President Zelensky's requests for more weapons, for tanks, for long-range missiles, etc., because of the stepped-up Russian effort. Now, Russia got its nose good and bloodied in the initial invasion, which exhibited all kinds of shortcomings and incompetencies on the part of the Russian military. They took heavy casualties. They did not achieve all their objectives. And Ukraine then had the opportunity to go on the offensive itself and take back some of the properties that Russia had initially succeeded in taking. Now, how would you gauge the respective sides as they face each other today? I mean, many people have called this a World War I style trench warfare.
It's more World War II style. Artillery is a big piece of it. Yeah. I think that would. It's an artillery war at the moment, pretty much.
Well, that's Russia's kind of war, isn't it?
Exactly. It's exactly their kind of war, and where they have significant advantages over Ukraine. You're quite right. They did very badly in the beginning. The Russians, their commanders were not good. They didn't realize the nature of the problem they faced, or the tenacity of the Ukrainians. I think they misjudged that very badly. Their lack of organization, the lack of proper use of equipment, especially armor, all was exploited heavily by the Ukrainians and successfully for a while. But I think where we are now is that, first of all, the Russians have gotten better at what they do. They've improved the quality of their warfare, and their leadership is better. In terms of numbers, the Russians certainly are much stronger than the Ukrainians. And even in a war of attrition, which I don't think it is at the moment, but if it was just that, over time, it's going to wear down Ukraine. They can't sustain it. They just don't have the manpower or the equipment or even an economy to support it all. So they're in somewhat dire condition, I think, right now. That's my opinion. I think a lot of the assessments that we've been getting, mostly from Ukrainian sources, have been highly optimistic and really haven't said, and it told us enough about the current situation. The Ukrainians are taking very heavy losses. So are the Russians, but the Russians can afford to take higher losses than Ukraine. And there's the question of replacement. It's very difficult for Ukraine to replace manpower and equipment as well. So it's getting to be one of those situations where I think we're ending up at a dangerous moment, because I think the United States does not want to see, and NATO certainly does not want to see, the Ukrainian resistance collapse. But I think there's a risk that it would, a serious risk. And one of the things that worries me a great deal is that there doesn't seem to be any objective intelligence on the Western side as to what the real situation is. The closest we've come was General Milley, who is the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And General Milley said, the casualties on both sides are about equal.
100,000.
Well, or more.
Yeah.
But it wasn't so much the number, that the casualties were about equal, says that Ukraine can't sustain that. I think he made that clear. He also said that there's no chance that Ukraine's going to take back the territory that the Russians have this year. So we have almost the entire year in front of us, and he says it's not going to happen. So I think that sent a message, or a strong message, inside the administration, but the administration so far hasn't figured out what to do.
Why are you saying it is not yet a war of attrition?
Because the Russians are making advances. The war of attrition, kind of where you have a stable front, and it's sort of like happened in Israel, and was it 71 when they had a war of attrition before the big war started. And they were firing rockets and artillery at each other, but nothing moved. But things are moving right now in Ukraine.
Around Bakhmut.
Bakhmut's one of the places, not the only one. But I think Bakhmut is the most sensitive one. The Ukrainians have tried to do a diversion down by Kherson to try and draw off some of the Russian forces, but they haven't been successful at it. And if Bakhmut falls, and it hasn't yet, but it's getting closer and closer, then Ukraine loses its supply lines and back to the front, and then they're in trouble. And it gives the Russians a chance to cross the Dnieper River and to move into central Ukraine. So that's a very sensitive part of the battle. But there are battles in Zaporizhzhia, there's battles in Kherson, there's battles in the north, in Luhansk, going on. So it's not just one place. But I think Bakhmut is the most sensitive.
How essential do you suppose these requests for more weapons are for Ukraine's success or survival Ukraine seems to have been highly successful in maneuver war
In the beginning,
in the beginning,
yes.
and Russia showed significant failures in that area,
Right.
and they, of course, took large losses. I was reminded, in a way, of what happened in World War II after the German invasion in 1941.
Precisely.
The Soviets took what for any other country would be considered catastrophic losses.
Right.
Yet they did learn from those losses, and they rearmed and went on the offensive. And they went on the offensive with what one almost could describe as mass human wave attacks against German positions. They took enormous personnel losses in fighting that way. There were commissars behind the front line with pistols to execute any Soviet soldier who decided that he didn't want to die that day. The German, basically, they would do this until the Germans ran out of ammunition. And then, of course, their leadership at the general officer level improved greatly, and they began to maneuver against the Germans successfully.
I think that's the key parallel.
Yeah, so I mean, what that demonstrated is Russia's ability to sustain large losses, their ability to learn from their failures, and to successfully come back. Now, that, of course, was the Soviet Union, which is a larger country than Russia is today. But tell me if that.
Well, they didn't have Eastern Europe then, so it was it wasn't that much bigger than it is now.
Okay, so where does that parallel apply, and where doesn't it? And it would seem to certainly be an optimistic appraisal of what Russia might achieve.
Well, look, I mean, what we're seeing is a switch by the Russians to a war using a lot of artillery to try and soften up and destroy the resources of the Ukrainian military, and then send troops into specific villages and towns to clean them out. And that seems to be the nature of the warfare that's going on right now. I don't think it's going to change very much. The Russians now appear to have air superiority, which they didn't in the beginning. They have degraded a lot of Ukraine's air defenses, and also it's some of its high-class weapons. So, yeah, I mean, that's what we're going to see more of. The question is, and I don't have the answer to this, is what are the Russians planning next? I mean, they have many options. They could keep the push going at Bakhmut and try to overrun the Ukrainians and force them to move whatever reserves they have up toward that battle and have a big battle, Stalingrad style, if you want. And that may be their strategy. Or they could decide to make a run for Kiev. I don't think they can do that right now, but they may. They've got a big spare force ready to go into the fight. I don't see how the Ukrainians can win it or to stabilize it. I just don't see it. And a lot of military experts agree with that assessment and said, the only hope right now is to try and reach some kind of political deal with the Russians that's acceptable to everybody, if it's possible.
Well, it's interesting that the Foreign Secretary of Russia made a remark the other day, Mr. Lavrov, that Russia would be open to a serious proposal from the United States to resolve the conflict, right. But that all they've heard is a message delivered from Blinken that Russia should withdraw, yeah. which is not, of course, a negotiation proposal. So it doesn't appear that, it appears that both sides think that they might succeed, and therefore they would try to push their advantages until they've strengthened their positions and therefore be in a stronger position to negotiate.
Yeah, I mean, that's true as long as you don't lose.
That's the risk.
That's the risk, and the risk is growing. Do we want to wait for the offensive to come and see what happens? Because I'm not sure there'll be time, honestly, to try and sort it out. You know, if that offensive looks like it's going to topple the Ukrainian government, I just don't see it. So I think that realistically speaking, it would be better, at least on some back channel, if not openly, negotiate. Now, the difficulty here is that the U.S. has been a big holdout about negotiations all along, going back to before 2014. That when the Europeans tried to broker a deal, and did broker a deal called the Minsk Agreement, first one in 2014 and the second one in 2015, the U.S. said we're not going to participate in that, and refused, and have consistently refused ever since. And of course, NATO now has the same official position, which is rather odd because it's not the position of Germany or France. But even so, there's an incongruity between what NATO says and what Germany and France say, which is rather bizarre. The U.S. has refused negotiations, doesn't want to have negotiations, did not want to support the Minsk agreements. I thought there was elements of the Minsk agreements which were not unfavorable to Ukraine. If I recall correctly, the Minsk agreements said that there could be autonomous areas inside Ukraine, but still under Ukrainian law, still with parliamentary representation in the Ukrainian parliament, but with a modicum of independence, which was to take care of the Russian-speaking population. The Russians were prepared to accept it. That was good enough for them, not good enough for the Ukrainians, and not good enough for the United States. And we've been stuck on that problem ever since. Nowadays, the Russians say, you know, the only people we will negotiate with at this stage of the game is the United States, because they're the power behind the throne. They're what's making this war happen. And if Washington doesn't want to negotiate, then there is no negotiation. If Washington does want to negotiate, we're open to it. The Russians constantly said they're willing to talk. So you can't say they've refused. They have not refused. It's the U.S. that's refused. It's very unusual for the United States to completely refuse a political dialogue.
Well, I mean, it's certainly fair to say that without the support of the United States, Ukraine couldn't fight this war.
For sure.
The thing is, how long can it continue to fight the war with a ruined economy, serious losses of manpower and personnel, leading to the constant pleas from President Zelensky for upgraded in weapons, particularly in tanks and long-range missiles.
Right. And airplanes now. He wants F-16.
He wants F-16s.
Yeah.
And whether it's their foreign minister or defense minister asked in a tweet the other day, please send us one of the German submarines for the
Black Sea.
Black Sea. Now, whether that was he was joking or serious, nobody knows. But how fast may things move? We know that President Biden was reluctant to agree to send the Abrams tanks to Ukraine.
Well, the U.S. wasn't planning to send any Abrams tanks at all. I mean,
right.
This was the Germans. What happened was, it was very straightforward. The Germans, we pressured the Germans to send the Leopard tanks. The Germans said no. We pressured them some more. The Germans said no. Then the Germans said, look, you're not sending Abrams. If you send Abrams, then we'll send Leopards, but otherwise we're not sending them.
Right.
So they essentially forced Washington into deciding to send Abrams. And now it's become very complicated because we don't have any to send. We can't take U.S. tanks out of inventory and send them because they have the special armor, which is vital to our armored forces, and we're not going to share that with anybody. And we certainly don't want the Russians to get their hands on any of those. So we have to take tank hulls that we have, strip them out, rebuild them with the proper armor that is acceptable and with degraded systems, because we're not going to put our best systems in them, and then ship them to Ukraine. So we're 4 or 5 months, maybe 6 months away.
Well, and then having been an armor officer myself, I believe it's a distant memory, but the armor officer basic school was about 3 months to learn how to operate those tanks and how to use them.
But that's where you had an infrastructure in place.
It was at that point at Fort Knox. So the tanks have to be built.
That's right.
And the Ukrainians have to be used to operate them. That's not a simple thing, and particularly when you get to the level of sophistication that's present in the Abrams tanks. Then you have to have the support infrastructure and repair facilities. This is a tank, as you well know, that uses jet fuel. It doesn't use diesel.
That's right.
So you need a completely different supply line to keep those tanks in the field. As you also know, they're very heavy tanks.
They're over 60 tons.
So to operate off-road or in a sloshy spring in Ukraine would be...
well, and I'm told that some of the bridges just won't support them. Yeah, it's too heavy.
But they can get the Leopard tanks much more quickly. Poland now has German permission to convey their Leopards to Ukraine. So those are weapons in the field. The Ukrainians have to be trained how to use them.
Yeah.
All told, I think we're talking about over 100 tanks conveyed to Ukraine. Now,
I don't know if you'll see that many.
Well, maybe not. But how big a difference will that make for Ukraine? The tank is an offensive weapon, and
well, of course, it depends how they're used. And how close up they get to the Russian forces, because the Russians have anti-tank weapons, quite good ones. The Leopards, we know, are highly vulnerable to Russian anti-tank weapons. We already saw that in Syria, where around 10 or more were destroyed by ISIS, not by any real army, but by ISIS holding Russian anti-tank weapons. So they are vulnerable tanks, so are Russian tanks. Even the Abrams is to a degree vulnerable, because most of them don't have any active protection systems, which is the name of the game today, I think.
You mean reactive armor?
No, that's a passive system.
Oh, I see.
Active protection is a system like the Israeli Trophy, which intercepts an incoming missile.
I see, yes.
And detonates it before it hits the tank. And that's a very slick technology. The Russians claim they have it, but they don't have it on any of their tanks. So either it doesn't work or they can't produce it, or both. The U.S. has been very slow in adopting Trophy. They haven't bought 100 units, more or less, so far, which is a drop in the bucket when you have a few thousand tanks. And I think the U.S. would prefer to have its own anti-tank system, but so far, at least, none of them have performed up to the level of the Trophy. The Trophy is an evolving system anyway. Keeps being improved. So without active protection on a tank today, I think a tank is vulnerable to anti-tank weapons and also to overhead attack. Let's say attack by aircraft or helicopters, gunships, with armor-piercing rounds, because the soft part of the tank's the top, the turret. And the hard part of the strong part of the tank is the frontal armor. And then the next vulnerable part on the sides. This is how it's done. So a tank's not it's not a perfect weapon. Its advantage is it moves and it has a big gun. And that's a key advantage.
Well, the President Zelensky is also very anxious to get long-range missiles.
Yeah.
They were successful with the HIMARS because the Soviet weapons depots were within reach of the range of the HIMARS with which we supplied Ukraine. The Russians, however, have learned from their losses, and they've moved their supply depots out of the range of the HIMARS, from what I understand.
That's right.
Thus, the urgent request from Zelensky for longer range missiles that can hit those supply depots. Because if he can't do that, then they're in real trouble.
Well, then you're attacking inside Russian territory a long way. And that raises a very dramatic question, which is, will the Russians, if that happens, will the Russians say, that's going far enough, we'll start taking out the sources of supply in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe that are making our lives difficult. So that means they could attack Poland, they could attack Germany, they could attack Romania. There's a lot of options.
Well, then they would have the consequence of a war with NATO.
That's right. Well, they think they're at war with NATO anyway.
Well, they do. I mean, they are very clear in saying that we are at war with them. They keep warning that escalating.
Well, and you have politicians in Europe saying we're at war with Russia. So you have this, sometimes it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You get what you get.
Well, the Russians have been clear enough in repeatedly saying that they have red lines.
Yeah.
Just as they said repeatedly for years, they had red lines regarding the possibility of Ukraine's membership in NATO. Those were repeatedly brushed off.
Right.
And then finally, Russia decided to make its move. Now they are saying red lines exist in terms of the provision of these high-tech weapons to the Ukrainians. And again, as you said, they say that we are already at war with them.
Right.
Now, President Biden, in a curious formulation, and I'm paraphrasing, said he instructed that the war not be widened.
Whatever that means.
Whatever that means, but it's something. It's something that.
Has he told Putin that?
Well, Secretary Blinken has repeated this. But on the other hand, how do you instruct that the war not be widened when you're taking actions that the opposing side in the war has said will lead to the wider war if they are taken? Now, so far, Russia has not acted on its threats, but what do you think is the tipping point for them to?
I don't know what the tipping point is. Honestly, don't. I have no idea. I think if the Russians felt that the provision of these weapons would actually shift the war against them, that would be the tipping point. At this point, the Russians are winning the war, in my opinion. Not by a lot, but they're winning the war.
You would have against you, for instance, General Ben Hodges, the former commander of U.S. Army Europe,
right,
who continues to be optimistic in terms of the Ukrainian impetus in this war. And the Russians have been, in a way, permanently set back.
I don't agree with that. They're on their third army now, the Ukrainians, because of the casualties. That's tremendous losses. It's very hard to get reliable information because we're left with what the Russians say and what the Ukrainians say. And what Washington says the same thing the Ukrainians say. So it's you have to sort through the noise.
Well, in any event, it seems that
the question is ask it the other way around. Yeah. How come the Russians are making gains slowly, but making gains and pushing the Ukrainians back slowly, but nonetheless doing so, and the Ukrainians are not making any gains
after having made significant gains in the fall? But the way in which you described the typical Russian way of fighting, which they exhibited throughout their history, is artillery, pulverize the enemy positions, then move in with the infantry. Now, frontline Ukrainians around Bakhmut are describing infantry moving earlier, sooner, And as one officer said, they just keep moving, and he's referring to the Wagner forces.
Yeah, well, Wagner's is not your normal military operation.
Oh, well, but the point is that they keep coming.
Yes, right.
And so that's a little bit of change in Russian strategy in that respect. And at a certain point, hoping to overwhelm the Ukrainian positions by using both infantry.
But they are overwhelming them. I mean, one at a time.
But no breakthrough yet.
Not enough to, well, the thing the Russians are trying to do with Bakhmut is surround it.
Right.
And they haven't done that yet.
They're at the north, the east, and the south.
They're all over the place, but they haven't closed the gap.
Right.
But the gap's narrowing. And that seems to be the primary focus of the war right now. And that's before another offensive that everybody is predicting. Of course, we don't know where that offensive will be exactly, or how it will, what it will be. But the Russians have a large number of soldiers, and as the Russians say, we can mobilize a lot more. So, as I said, my concern is that, I was sent to Vietnam by the Foreign Relations Committee years ago, 74 and 75. And in 75, I was taken up to I Corps, the northernmost part of South Vietnam at the time. An I Corps commander, who was their top general, briefed me. He said, "We got it under control. Nothing's going to happen. We're stronger than they are, blah, blah, blah." And a month later, he was defeated on the battlefield, and the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, rolled down towards Saigon. And there were one or two more battles, but it was all over but the shouting. So I worry that that's what we could see in Ukraine.
Well, it was all over but the shouting because the U.S. Congress cut off funding.
But they had plenty of weapons. It wasn't a question of lack of supply. It was a question of being, huh?
We withdrew Air Force support for them. That was the most critical thing because by that time it was a conventional North Vietnamese army attacking South.
That's right.
That was vulnerable to our Air Force, but we withdrew that support and left that.
Yeah, we left the Vietnamese with some F-5s and some attack helicopters, some Hueys, but it wasn't enough.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but that was withdrawing.
By the way, that's not unlike what you're seeing in Ukraine right now, because they have Ukraine's Air Force is all but decimated.
But the other parallel is that the Soviets quintupled their support for the North Vietnamese, just as the United States withdrew its support.
That's true. Absolutely right.
Now, that doesn't seem to be in the cards here regarding this Ukraine-Russia conflict, that NATO and the United States is doubling down on its support. But what do you think of this, Steve? The fact that these supplies will not be effectively in the field for many months, and in some cases up to at least a year,
right,
incentivizes the Russian forces to make that lunge sooner rather than later before the Ukrainians are equipped and trained on.
I absolutely agree. I think we've accelerated their push to try and take as much as they can take now. And we haven't tried to engage them. In fact, the other thing I wanted to mention to you, which bothers me a great deal, is we're putting all these sanctions on Russia and on Russians. We sanctioned, the Wagner Group is sanctioned, the Russian military leaders are sanctioned, Russian oligarchs are sanctioned, Russian political leaders are sanctioned, blah, blah. Sort of saying to them, there's no chance we're going to talk to you. We put you on sanctions. So you're cutting off any avenue of dialogue. And yet, I don't understand that. I honestly don't. I think it's foolish.
Well, speaking of the sanctions, economic reports have come out that the Russian economy contracted only 3.5% last year. So the the devastation that was predicted from the effect of these sanctions has not been felt in a dramatic way yet. Now, whether they might be, the longer this war continues, is another question, which raises a very important...
Actually, the Germans have suffered more economically than the Russians.
This also raises the question of ammunition, which plays into who might win a war of attrition if it does become a war of attrition. Who runs out of ammunition first? Now, there are reports that the United States has been drawing down ammunition supplies from South Korea, from our arms supply depots in Israel.
That's right.
And sending it to Ukraine. And our anti-tank missiles are other supplies that we have...
No, those are backed up a couple of years.
Well, that's... See, the other thing... And also, we know that NATO is not well armed. It's neglected... Those NATO countries in Europe have neglected their defense for many years. It's very thin. They don't seem to have the industrial base anymore to rearm, and neither does the United States. Thus, we can only be depleted to a certain point in terms of those weapons and ammunition before we make ourselves highly vulnerable. How soon do you think it is before we have reached that point?
Depends on the category of weapon, of course, and how hard it is to replace. So if you're dealing with...
Precision.
Well, take the Stinger.
Yes.
We had reached a point where we decided not to build any more Stingers because we'll have a new version in the future, new air defense. So we stopped making them. The production line is gone. The people who know how to make them are gone. The supply chain for them, the integrated circuits and other sensors and things like that, that's gone. So we can't replace them. It's wishful thinking to think that we're going to replace them. Things like 155 howitzer shells, we can make, but we don't have any, the industry's not set up for it right now. We have to reestablish all that. We're not on a war footing in this country. Certainly in Europe, they've never been on a war footing since World War II. I mean, they just don't. So it's not it's not the kind of thing you want to put those. You're taking a lot of risks. You're taking risks in Asia. You're taking risks in Europe, where you're really not prepared for that kind of risk. Russian industry also was sleeping to some extent. But they claim, and I don't know if it's true or not, but they claim they have got it running 24/7 now, all the time, and that they're producing what they need to produce. And it may be the case, but I can't prove it, and I don't think anybody else can. They say so.
There are certain stories that the higher tech Russian weapons use American components in their production. So unless they have a huge supply backlog of those components, they can certainly run into trouble there.
They can, but I think the stuff that's mostly in demand from the Russian side are rockets and ammunition, which is not high tech, and doesn't depend so much on those components. Where they've been hurting is things like drones, because they didn't have the parts anymore, but they got bailed out by the Iranians, who do have the parts. Now, we could prevent that, but we haven't done much about it.
So supposedly they're getting supplies from North Korea as well now.
But not of drones. North Korea doesn't have any. If they got them, they get them from China or from Iran. No, there was an argument made that they were getting artillery shells from North Korea. It may be true, may not be true, I don't know. But I think there was a dip, a moment when the Russian supply dipped pretty low, but I think they're rebuilding that.
Well, they say that the the artillery barrages from the Russians in recent weeks is reached the highest level within, I forget the exact time frame, but many, many months.
Yes, it's really high right now.
Very high. So they certainly must have gotten resupplied.
Which tend to tell us that one of two things. Either they think they're at the point where they can break through, so they're really pouring it on, so to speak. Or it would tell us that, in fact, they're not worried about reserves. They have it. But both, probably both. I read the Russian press every day in English. TASS, Sputnik, RT, those are sort of common. And then Twitter stuff, because the Russians flood that too.
What are you learning from that?
Well, what I'm learning, mostly the best one is TASS in terms of detail. And they're providing on a daily basis, we've knocked off this many artillery units, we got rid of this many counter battery radars, we killed this many Ukrainian soldiers, that kind of thing. And where? Which village, which town, which place. And they're providing a very detailed information. Now, it could all be a lie. I have no way to know. But if it is, it's really pretty creative. And the Ukrainians aren't saying it isn't true. So I'm taking it for what it's worth. I think the Russians are causing a lot of damage to the Ukrainians.
There's really no accurate way for us to judge the...
No, not without overhead capability.
Well, that and also the tenor of the peoples in Russia in terms of how they're in favor of or opposed to this war against Ukraine, and whether Putin is maintaining his support or whether he's becoming...
Well, they claim the polls have been taken where it shows him with 80-some% support.
Yeah, well, if you want to believe it.
I don't. I mean, it's not a democracy.
Well, one thing for sure is it's usually not a sign of success or health if you keep changing the general officers who are running the war in Ukraine. So the latest move is Putin has put Gerasimov in charge, expecting him to do what the other commanders were incapable of doing, and that is make substantial gains. Now, is there anything you might know about him that would help us understand how he might change those failures into a success?
No, the only thing you can tell is how they're fighting the war. You can't, like other generals these days, he hasn't fought a war before. This is his first war. I mean, Syria, yeah, but it's not really a war. That's against ISIS or against whoever they're fighting there. Small stuff. But in the big picture, no. But, we've fought wars. I'll give it, we've had Iraq, we've had Afghanistan, we move our forces around. We have done, I think, in terms of readiness, a much better job than the Russians ever did. In terms of sophistication, we're much better. Net-centric warfare, things like that, which we're developing, the Russians don't even have.
And combined arms warfare.
Combined arms warfare, we're very good at that. We have very good air power, I think, and then of course we have very good intelligence, which is what's helped the Ukrainians, by the way, because we put tremendous amount of intelligence assets at their disposal.
So let's talk once again about this escalatory path. The demands from President Zelensky are incessant for a very good reason.
Yeah.
They're under major threat.
Yes, sure.
So sometimes there's reluctance on the part of the United States, as there was with the Abrams. There's reluctance based on the fact that, as President Biden instructed, he doesn't want a larger war. Nonetheless, these weapons then are provided after that period of hesitation, and now the campaign from President Zelensky is to provide F-16s.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that's likely to happen, at least with Ukrainian pilots. I mean, there's a risk that the U.S. would send in, that if this thing goes south, that the U.S. will send in the U.S. Air Force.
Well, that would be a major escalation, wouldn't it?
Yes, that would be a war, a wider war. But I think that's sort of where we're at. So.
Well, the United States would do that if the United States thinks that the penalties from Ukraine losing the war would affect our position in Europe and elsewhere, that we would...
That's right, which is why...
to take that major risk.
But, back in 2017, I wrote an article called Will NATO Fight? And can it? And can it? And my thought then was that we could not. That we're not in good enough shape. I don't have too much I mean, we've made some improvements. Look, this thing, it's not like we've been sitting on our hands. We've made some improvements, but those are incremental improvements, really, not dramatic. And we're talking about brigades, not armies.
Right.
We bought some better weapons, but you have the Baltic countries, which have very minimal capabilities. You have Germany, which has almost no capabilities today. It's a mess. Poland is better than most of them, but who knows how much. And they're in between. By the way, talking about Poland giving up its tanks, it's only going to give them up as quickly as the South Korea, delivers the new tanks.
Yes.
Well, they only got 10 of them so far.
Yes.
So they're not going to strip out all their tanks right now. They would be irresponsible.
Well, I share your skepticism as I would look at the NATO forces and wonder, as the crisis with Ukraine increased, we flew over I think something like 14,000 American troops.
Right.
Sort of reassure the Europeans, but then you look at the other 29 countries in NATO. Can't they, assemble a force serious enough to take on any potential threat?
The short answer is no.
The answer is no, because when you think how long would it take NATO to mobilize a force serious enough?
They cannot mobilize anything.
To convince the Russians not to make a move, and you've answered that question.
Well, that's essentially what I wrote in 2017.
Well, but here's the other side of that question, Steve. What else do the Russians have to throw into this? We could say that NATO is weak, but Russia's...
Oh, well, they haven't used even a small part of their army.
But their army is not... There's
the Russians
trained or...
Well, I don't know. I mean, what we saw in Ukraine wasn't very trained. It wasn't very professional, and it wasn't very well commanded.
But they were bringing in components of their Far East
bits and pieces
before they invaded, which was, even though I was talking to a Russian who was very close to Putin and was his top economic advisor for some years, he kept saying, if you can see what the Russians are doing, they're not going to invade. And my counter to him was, look, they're moving units from the Far East to the Ukrainian border. They're not going to do that just for a public relations exercise. They're going to move.
But they were also not wanting to weaken their defenses facing Europe when they could pull these disparate units in. So they were protecting themselves from a vulnerability, I think. Although more recently they put in some of their first-class units. Some of them got chewed up.
And that's just fighting Ukraine, not NATO or the Americans.
Yeah, but I think the Ukrainians are maybe far better organized to fight than the Europeans.
Well, they've certainly had more experience fighting by this time since 2000.
They have more experience. They have a greater desire.
Higher morale.
Higher morale, at least they did. And they were very well trained. I don't think that's the case of Europe, whether it's Germany or France or Italy or any.
So that would seem, in terms of...
Britain almost has no army anymore, Britain.
Neither does Germany. Yeah, it's just France has...
So what are we talking about?
A serious... But that would seem to be kind of a stalemate in this escalatory scenario because
Well,
it doesn't clear Russia has the capability to move westward, nor does NATO have the capability to move eastward. So maybe that's not the way the escalation would happen. Of course, the frightening scenario is tactical nuclear weapons, but
right.
that
But let me ask a fundamental question. What do we need to have NATO in Ukraine for?
I mean, why do we need Ukraine in NATO?
Well, I took it the other way around. NATO in Ukraine.
Yeah, because Ukraine can't survive.
Yeah, but that wasn't true before the war started. Why do we want to have NATO in Ukraine? What's the point of it? Why do we want to upset the balance of power in Europe? What was the goal?
Well, the goal is interpreted by the Russians was to fatally weaken Russia's
right. Maybe that was the goal, but
but now that Russia's left in the situation with the prospective membership of Finland and Sweden to be in a unlike the Baltic states, which are so weak they don't present any threat to Russia. The Finns take their self-defense seriously, and there's a 800-mile border with Russia.
Right.
So Russia ends up, should they obviously Turkey is the major problem child in the accession of those two countries into NATO. But when they get in, Russia will have produced the exact opposite of what their objective was.
Well, yeah, but look, first of all, there's no consensus in NATO.
Regarding what?
Regarding fighting the Russians. Hungarians don't want to.
Who?
The Hungarians don't want
No,
to. The Turks don't want to.
Well, those, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and they have 28 other countries who are fine with it.
I wouldn't say they're fine with it. I think they've kept their heads down, but I'm not sure whether they're really so much in favor of getting involved in a general war, whether that's something they want. So I don't think if there was a real vote in NATO, whether it would be possible to get the consensus. Article 5 of NATO is the key collective defense part of the NATO agreement. But it requires 100% consensus. Not going to happen.
So as you know, the NATO General Secretary, Jens Stoltenberg, was recently in South Korea.
Yeah, and in Japan, too.
Yeah, I'm trying to encourage South Korea to supply weapons to Ukraine. They've been supplying humanitarian supplies, but not weapons. So he, in his public remarks in Seoul, was saying it's extremely important that Russia not win this war, that Putin's forces would be bad for Ukraine, the success of Putin's forces, and a dangerous message to authoritarian leaders such as President Xi Jinping of China, I'm quoting him, that they can get what they want through the use of force, unquote. So, is that a convincing message to our Asian allies?
No.
I mean, they're the ones most directly under threat of Xi Jinping taking Taiwan.
Yes, especially Japan.
Yes, indeed.
But I think it's a totally different dynamic, different issue. And I don't agree with Stoltenberg. I think he's been too much of a proponent of war when he doesn't have the membership that supports it. I don't think he's being constructive. There's no chance the Koreans are going to supply weapons to the Ukraine war. They have enough problems taking care of themselves. The Japanese aren't going to do it.
They have enough problems.
They have enough problems of their own. And they're worried that the U.S. is by throwing everything it has into the Ukraine war, is leaving them, without any fighting capability. So they're not happy.
That's at a time in which the United States is facing its major threat its major opponent from China, which has developed a very serious military. And we now are diverted in terms of our supplies by this war in Ukraine. I would think that that can't help but weaken our posture in Asia, just at the moment when we need to strengthen.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, have you noticed that items, including tanks, for Taiwan have been delayed for a number of years? The F-16s for Taiwan have been delayed for a number of years. The HIMARS for Taiwan has been delayed for a long time. I mean, we can't supply it.
And an American general recently made a statement. I forget whether he was in the Air Force or in an Asian command, saying that
2 years in a war.
Yeah, troops get ready because this is this war is going to take place within 2 years.
Well, that's his opinion. I don't have an opinion about that, actually, because I don't know.
Well, you and a group of retired American generals and admirals published quite a study.
That's right.
Assessing the situation between China and Taiwan.
Right.
And how to protect Taiwan from a successful invasion by China.
That's correct.
I know that's something you've spent a lot of
time and with a group of generals and admirals who served in the Pacific, know the place intimately well. We're underprepared for Asia, and we're getting weaker in Asia. And the Ukraine war is contributing to that in serious ways, which is another reason why, I asked the question, why do we need NATO in Ukraine? Why don't we try to figure out a solution, a political solution? I think the Russians would settle for some absolute guarantees of no NATO in Ukraine. They would give a lot for that.
Well, plus keeping the territories that they have gained.
I'm not even sure that, well, some of it, Crimea for sure, but the rest of it is less certain in my mind.
Well, they've now said those.
Yeah, now they're supposed to be recognized.
Are now parts of Russia and will be forever.
People can change their opinions if the price is right, if the deal is right, if the arrangements are right. It can be transitional period. I mean, there's all kinds of possible ways to finesse it. The real issue is, what's the most important thing to the Russians? Right? And to me, the most important thing to the Russians is that Ukraine is not NATO territory. That's the important thing to them. That they agree on. The rest of it's politics, in my opinion.
We did a Westminster show late last year with an extraordinarily bright young lady who said almost all wars end in negotiation. And negotiations are not yet taking place.
As far as we know.
As far as we know. Though they did take place over getting the Ukrainian grain out of the Black Sea so that we weren't facing mass starvation in Africa and other parts of the world. But so I wonder what would tip this into a negotiation phase. One side or the other would have to suffer serious reverses that they would think are not recoverable, and that therefore it's time to end this thing.
Yeah, but that's the worst time to make a negotiation.
Exactly, so that's in a way an incentive to keep fighting, but
the Israeli, the Egyptian war, the Yom Kippur war.
Yes.
The Israelis had trapped the Third Army, the Egyptian Third Army, and then Kissinger moved in and pushed everybody, including the Russians, into working a deal. First a disengagement, and then then beyond that. I don't know that we have that kind of luxury in this situation, because it could break the wrong way. And then
what do you mean by that?
Well, that means that the Russians could start to really win and move rapidly. And at that point, it may be hopeless. and then they'll dictate the terms. So that's why I don't quite understand. I don't know what intelligence assessments the president's getting, but I was listening to Milley, and what he was saying is not optimistic, whatever. And what I would hope is that Milley would take himself over to the White House and say, you guys better sort this out. Let's lower the temperature. Let's open the door to the conversation with the Russians. I said in another context, the best guy to do it, by the way, the best guy to actually carry out the negotiations on the U.S. side is probably Milley, because he's a respected military guy. The Russians would respect him. They would treat him with respect. He knows how to treat them with respect. He has had conversations with Gerasimov, so it's not something he hasn't done already. What they've actually said, I don't know. But he doesn't have a mandate from the White House or the State Department.
Well, certainly the the Biden administration has put itself in a difficult position by portraying the war in the terms that they have: authoritarianism versus democracy that has global significance in this conflict. If it then could step back and accept certain Russian gains in order to end the war, it seems politically the administration would first have to find itself in the situation where support for the Ukraine war and the more than $100 billion committed in support of that war so far, that the American public begins questioning these kinds of expenditures, and that the support for the war in Ukraine erodes. It's already declined to a certain extent, but it's still majority support.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if that's how you do it. But Trump is now saying he could settle this war, and that he considers Biden reckless, not doing so. He has a big following, huge following.
I believe he said before the start of the war, probably sometime before it, that he told Zelensky, look, just make the best deal you can.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case.
Which back then wouldn't have been such a bad deal.
Well, like I said before, the Minsk agreements weren't a bad deal for Ukraine necessarily. There'd been a lot of people alive today, a lot more people alive today, if we had implemented them. And I think it could have been done. I don't think Putin was looking for a war. He was looking for a solution. It's still possible. I think the real question is what would move the White House to decide that they ought to at least open the door to some conversations instead of treating Russians like criminals and ostracizing Russia at every turn and in every possible way, because that's not how you get a negotiation.
Well, I don't think it's simply Ukrainian propaganda that the Russians, in certain instances in Ukraine, have behaved like criminals.
There are war crimes on both sides.
War crimes, yeah.
On both sides.
Well, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I am. I'm pretty sure. But that's not the issue.
No, it's not. It makes it harder.
It makes it, well, anytime you have this kind of brutality,
yeah,
it makes it harder. It makes it difficult for anyone to make any concessions. But I think we have a national interest here that we have to protect our national interest. We have to keep ourselves strong in the Pacific. We have to keep NATO together. We don't want it to spin out of control if things go south. So I think we have reason to want to have some conversations with the Russians. It may not work.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time right now, and the topic which we addressed today is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Is there a way out?
Right.
The answer seems to be we don't know yet.
I think that's as fair as you can be at this point.
But I want to thank Dr. Stephen Bryen from the Center for Security Policy for joining us today to discuss this very important topic and bringing his wealth of experience and perspective to it. I invite our viewers to go to the Westminster Institute webpage or YouTube channel to see the other programs we've done with Dr. Stephen Bryen, the other programs we've done on Russia-Ukraine, including, by the way, with General Ben Hodges, whom I mentioned earlier, and programs on China, Taiwan, Japan, the general strategic picture in Asia, and other subjects as well, including what the sources of inflation are, and a few other subjects that seem off our regular beaten path. But thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoy this program and join us again. I'm Robert Riley.